Would you ask Mr. Evans to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Mr. Evans, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Willett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Evans, we will come back in due course to the dealings you had with Kingspan, but I'd now like to turn to the BBA certificates for K15. Can we start, please, with your witness statement at page 17 and look together at paragraphs 51, 52 and 53 on that page? This sits under the heading, the use of combustible insulation materials in buildings with a story over 18 metres. And you say this at 51. The issues with combustible insulation, in particular Kingspan's K15, arose in late 2013. Prior to those issues arising, Nhbc's position on accepting K15 on buildings over 18 metres was that there was a current BBA, or British Board of Agreement BBA certificate for the product, indicating it was acceptable for use in accordance with approved document B, subject to advice being sought from the certificate holder. Therefore, providing Kingspan gave appropriate confirmation, Nhbc would deem that the builder had demonstrated compliance with the building regulations and accept the use of K15 on projects over 18 metres, subject to it passing Nhbc's other site-specific checks. This was on the basis that Regulation 7 of the Building Regulations permitted reliance on independent product certification schemes in the UK to accept the use of a material. If we go over the page, we initially retained this approach whilst engaging with Kingspan until the change set out at paragraph 105 below. I cannot say why BBA set this requirement, but once Nhbc received Kingspan's confirmation, the builder had complied with the terms of the BBA certificate. And we'll come back a little bit later to your statement, which deals with events that took place in 2015 in relation to Kingspan and the technical guidance note. But just looking at these paragraphs, Mr. Evans, from what date up until February 2015 was the policy that you describe there, the policy at Nhbc?
Sorry, from the date it started?
Yes.
As far as I'm aware, from when the BBA certificate would have been issued.
Right. So, and that was 2008, 27th of October 2008. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And we'll come to the document in a moment. But just to be clear, is it right, therefore, that every scheme which proposed to use or did use K15 that came to the Nhbc, either for warranty purposes or for building control services, until February 2015, was considered acceptable for use, subject to Kingspan giving appropriate confirmation?
If it was being assessed in line with the BBA certificate, yes.
And that was because of, is this right, you say in line with the term, was that because of the precise terms of the BBA certificate?
Yes.
Now, you say in your statement that you didn't know why the BBA included the wording about contacting the manufacturer. Did you ever contact them and discuss it with them?
I didn't know.
Why is that?
I wasn't the primary contact with BBA. I understand that colleagues at Nhbc did subsequently make contact with BBA.
Colleagues being Dave White, I think.
Dave White, Graham Perrier.
Right. And when was that?
That would have been in 2014.
Why not earlier?
The matter only came to my attention in 2013. I can't say for why it wasn't raised earlier.
Let's go to BBA 6038, please. This is the certificate. And if we look at the first page, we can see that it is Agreement Certificate 08/4582. It will be familiar to the panel, I think, from Module 2 of this inquiry. And the subject matter is Kingspan Insulation Cool Foam K15, product scope and summary of certificate there on the left. This certificate relates to Cooltherm K15 rain screen insulation board, a rigid phenolic board with foil composite facings for use as external thermal insulation on new and existing steel frame or masonry walls. The board is used in domestic and non-domestic buildings in conjunction with masonry or weatherlight ventilated cladding systems. Then if you look down, please, if we scroll down to the lower part of page 1, we see first under key factors assessed, the third item there, behaviour in relation to fire. The boards will not contribute to the development stages of a fire or present a smoke or toxic hazard, see section 7. And then if you look at the very bottom of the page, bottom of the screen, date of first issue 2008. You see that there. So that's the date of the certificate. And if we go to page 5, we can see section 7, which is referred to under one of the key factors assessed I just showed you. Section 7, behaviour in relation to fire. The following fire tests have been undertaken. To BS 8414 Part 1, 2002, we have the first bullet point. You see that?
I do.
Can I take it, without reading it all to you, that it's familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
That is a reference, I think, back to the test that was done by Kingspan in 2005. Do you know that? Or?
I believe so, yes.
Right. And then if we go to 7.2, the product is classified as class 0 or low risk as defined in the documents supporting the National Building Regulations. The product, therefore, may be used in accordance with the provisions of England and Wales, approved document B, paragraph 8.4, volume 1, and paragraphs 12.5 and 12.6, volume 2. See also diagram 40. You see that?
I do, yes.
Yeah, no reference there to 12.7. Yes?
No?
No.
Yes, no.
No. But 12.5 and 12.6 in diagram 40. And just then going back, if we can, before we look at 7.3, to the tests that were carried out. At 7.1, we can see the specific build-up there in detail, yes?
Yes.
What did you understand the significance of that part of this certificate to be?
That was a description of the test which was undertaken, which BBA had then looked at and made the statements they do in their certificate.
Yeah. And what was your view? What was NHBC's view, so far as you knew, about the significance of the precise details set out in that part of the certificate?
It illustrated that the material had been tested.
Yes. Anything else?
I think my view at that time was, on initial reading, until we had, was that it had been tested to 8414.
Right. And then you can see a second test, which is the test EN 1364 Part 1, which was a fire resistance test for non-load-bearing walls. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. So did you understand this section, 7.1, and the two tests there, to mean that there had only been one successful BS 8414 test on K15 by the time this certificate was released in 2008? And there is the details of the build-up for the purposes of that test.
I understood that those are the tests which BBA had examined as part of pulling this certificate together, yes.
And you would have understood, is this right, that that was under Part 1, 2002 masonry, not Part 2, 2005 steel frame?
Yes.
So would you have understood at all times that this certificate did not cover the application of Kingspan K15 on a steel-framed external wall build-up?
The certificate that I was looking at when I started to look at this in 2013 was the 2010 revision. So there is a later revision of this certificate.
We'll come to the next one. Take it from me, from the evidence we explored with the BBA at Module 2, that this was the certificate that was extant until the summer of 2013. You think there was something else?
I believe there was a further revision to this.
There are revisions
Yep.
during 2013. We'll come to them.
Yep.
I don't want there to be any confusion.
But I believe the later revision introduced the paragraph 12.7.
You are right. But that was not until July 2013.
Okay.
We'll come to it. Let's not get ahead. I just want to be clear, though, because between the time of the issue of this certificate in October 2008 and the later revision introducing 12.7, to which we will come, you understood, I'm putting to you, that there had only been one successful BS 8414 test on K15, and that was under Part 1 masonry and not Part 2 steel frames.
That's correct.
And therefore, there was no basis on which the BBA certificate covered the application of K15 above 18 metres in an external wall build-up on a steel-framed structure.
On this certificate, yes.
And given that you were only working on the certificate and not doing your own investigations, the NHBC's position ought to have been never to have approved any K15 above 18 metres on a steel-framed structure. No?
If we can go to the second page of the certificate, please.
Yes, and we'll come to that in a moment. But just looking at this, any departure from the precise form of this test would have taken it outside the 8414 route to compliance, wouldn't it?
It would, yes.
Yes, thank you. Now let's turn to the next page, please, paragraph 7.2, which I've shown you. And coming back to 7.2, paragraph 12.5, I think you understood to be that part of approved document B, which provided that external walls should meet the guidance in 12.6 to 12.9.
Yes.
Yes. Or alternatively, meet the performance criteria in BR 135. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And 12.6 is the external walls having to meet the provisions of diagram 40. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. So you understood that. And then if you look at 7.3, towards the top of page 5, it says this. In buildings with a floor more than 18 metres above ground level, advice should be sought from the certificate holder. Now, the certificate holder was Kingspan, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Yeah. And going back then to paragraph 52 of your statement, which we've just seen at page 17, you tell us, I think, is this right, that you took this clause, 7.3 here, in the BBA certificate as meaning that you had to ask Kingspan for, as you put it, appropriate confirmation before deeming that the builder had demonstrated compliance with the building regulations. Is that right?
It's not the case that I had to ask them. It was the case that the builder had to ask them. So the builder would seek the advice from Kingspan, and that would be the information that they would provide to us or any other building control body to demonstrate compliance.
I see. What was appropriate confirmation?
A letter from Kingspan. We would have taken a letter from Kingspan verifying they'd looked at the design and they were happy for that material to be used over 18 metres.
Did the NHBC ever stipulate what the technical content or methodology for the appropriate confirmation was to be before it would be accepted by the NHBC?
There was no set criteria, no.
Why not?
Because we would leave it to the professional skill and judgment of the surveyor who was reviewing that in terms of whether they had that enough information for them to be satisfied that the BBA, the conditions in the BBA certificate had been met.
Well, what skill and judgment was required? Either Kingspan was going to be a material of limited combustibility, which it wasn't, so that would only leave an 8414 test exactly in accordance with the build-up specified at 7.1. What else would there be?
I don't recall seeing any of those letters from or any documentation from Kingspan.
Do you
so
not?
I can't verify. Not at this stage, no.
Right. Did you ever investigate who, as a matter of course within Kingspan, would be giving these appropriate confirmations?
No, I didn't.
And what about making sure they had the appropriate qualifications to provide these appropriate confirmations?
No, I didn't.
Did NHBC, when obtaining this approval, or rather ensuring that its builders obtained that approval, ever seek to ensure that the person giving the approval at Kingspan had relevant fire safety experience, training and knowledge?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Why not?
We would have looked to see if it was from the technical department, and I feel that would have been accepted at that time.
Right. And can we assume that these confirmations would not be in respect of exactly the same build-up as the one tested and described in detail in 7.1 in the certificate, but different build-ups?
It could well be, yes.
So, to be clear, was it NHBC's policy to treat K15, a combustible material, as compliant for use above 18 metres and warrant its use solely in reliance on the approval of its manufacturer?
It would have been accepted in accordance with the conditions within the BBA certificate, which, yes, I can see in terms of that, yes, a letter from the manufacturer would have been sufficient.
Well, let's break that up. Were you ever aware of NHBC accepting a build-up which was, in the real world, a build-up which was precisely in accordance with the build-up as tested, as described in detail at paragraph 7.1 of the certificate?
I'm not aware, but that doesn't mean to say that there isn't any.
No, you're not aware of any. And therefore, most, if not all, of those build-ups would have been different. And therefore, would it follow from that that in accepting the advice from the certificate holder, NHBC was relying solely, in respect of a rig that differed from the rig described in 7.1, solely on the say-so of its own manufacturer?
I would say not solely on that, because the BBA certificate, which was from a trusted organisation, was saying that in those buildings over 18 metres, the advice from them was that the condition of that condition was that advice should be sought from the certificate holder.
Did NHBC ever investigate for itself the basis on which Kingspan was giving these approvals where these rigs differed, as they did, from the rig as tested?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Why not?
It would not necessarily have been the focus at this time.
Well, given that Kingspan was making and selling K15, could you just explain how its own approval of the use of its own product on a project would have been any kind of reliable indicator of its compliance with ADB?
That would be a question for the BBA.
No, it's a question for the NHBC, isn't it, who is relying on the certificate and also relying on advice to be sought from the certificate holder. And if all you've got is advice from the certificate holder, namely Kingspan, who is making and selling its own product, how is that reliable? Where is the independent analysis of the fire safety of this material?
If the surveyor thought that it was unsafe at that time and not being used in accordance with its certificate, the surveyor could raise that with the builder. But this was a product which for a number of years we'd seen being used on buildings, and it was a familiar product that was accepted whether you were a local authority and approved inspector. So it was something which we were familiar with seeing. Perhaps it was just taken that Brian, they'd meet the BBA certificate if it met the conditions under that it was the case.
Was it the thought processes in NHBC at the time that because it was familiar, it was safe, and because it was familiar, it was compliant? Was that the thinking? It must be all right because everybody else uses it.
I think this is one material on a building which contains thousands and thousands of materials, and those that you're familiar with and have seen in a number of instances before, yes, there can be assumptions made that somebody else has perhaps looked at it.
Did anyone at the NHBC recognise at the time that it was underwriting through the warranty and accepting as compliant through building control services the use of a combustible product in an external wall over 18 metres on the untested and unexamined say-so of the manufacturer of that very product?
Not that I'm aware of until we started to look at this in 2013.
Yes. And was that not a glaringly, obviously dangerous approach, not only for the NHBC reputationally and financially, but to the health and safety of the occupants of these buildings?
I can see how you can see that, or how you can arrive at that conclusion, but there's still no, at that point, there was still nothing to say that those buildings were dangerous, because if those configurations it had been used with, there's nothing to say if those configurations had been tested, that they wouldn't be demonstrated to be safe.
Indeed. But you had no way of knowing that, did you?
No.
No. Did you ever discuss this approvals practice with Wintec, for example? Do you know?
I didn't know.
Do you know whether anybody did?
I'm not aware of, no.
Now, we've seen in Module 2 of this inquiry some examples of the confirmations that Kingspan was providing to customers about the use of their products. And and I hope I'm doing them no disservice to say that they were simply Kingspan-headed letters that said, in their opinion, K15 could be used in the proposed build-up. Would that be, is my description of them, generic though it be, generally correct?
The ones I've seen have got a little bit more technical information in them as to why they believe they're correct.
Right. Well, let's look at your statement, page 17, please, paragraph.
Before we do that, can I just ask this? Did it occur to anyone that it was rather odd to have this self-certification provision in 7.3 limited to buildings over 18 metres? I mean, it's a curious thing to find, isn't it?
Until 2013, I didn't question it.
No.
And to be fair, before 2013, I wasn't familiar with the BBA certificate for Kingspan K15.
Right.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing one might have thought a surveyor might perhaps have seen as being a bit unusual.
Yes, but I say at the time, the focus of the industry was very much on thermal efficiency. The drive from government was very much on thermal efficiency, changes to the U values, and the thermal efficiency of walls. In many cases, the only way you could achieve that was to use this type of insulation. So it was a familiar product which was introduced, was seen, and with lots of things, if you see it a lot, sometimes it's just accepted as that's the norm.
All right. Yes, thank you. Yes, Mr. Willett, sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's all right. Can we then go back to paragraph 52 of your statement, please? Page 17. And I've read it to you before. I just want to examine something in it. 6 lines up from the bottom of the page, you say, therefore, you see that, and then you talk about the appropriate confirmation. And then if you turn... and if you go to the very bottom of the page, you say, this was on the basis that Regulation 7 of the building regulations permitted reliance on independent product certification schemes in the UK to accept the use of a material. You see that?
Yes. Yep.
Now, is what you're referring to there, the certification of products by the BBA, accredited as they were at the time by UCAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service?
Yes, that would be one of the third-party certification schemes, yeah.
And therefore, are you saying, therefore, that NHBC felt that they could rely on what was written on a BBA certificate?
Yes.
Now, Regulation 7, it's right, I think, isn't it, that it permitted reliance on independent certification schemes, but not reliance on the manufacturer's self-certification. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
Indeed, you might ask, did you ask, well, how come the BBA is an independent certification at all, given that all it's doing is referring you back to the manufacturer?
Yes.
You did?
So I can see how you can look at that, yeah.
But the question I've just asked you, was that a question you asked yourself or the NHBC asked itself corporately before 2013?
No, the assumption would have been that BBA had assessed the information it had been provided with in making their assessment, and they were comfortable in making that statement to refer to the manufacturer.
Well, let's look at Regulation 7 then, because you rely on it. It's at INQ 30.14930. Now, what I'm showing you here is the 2013 edition, and it's called Approved Document 7, Regulation 7. Just looking at it on its face, is this what you are referring to when you refer to Regulation 7?
Yes.
Yes. And if we go to page 10 in this document, we can see Regulation 7 of the building regulation, first of all, set out, and it refers to materials and workmanship, and you can see it on the screen there. There's nothing about independent certification there, but if we go to page 13 of this document, help me, you can see there, and there's a heading in the middle of your screen, independent certification schemes, and you can see paragraphs 1.15 and 1.16. Is that what you're referring to in your witness statement when you refer to Regulation 7?
Yes, it is.
Right. Now let's look at those in detail. 115 says this: there are many independent product certification schemes in the UK and elsewhere that may provide information on the performance of a product. Such schemes certify that a material complies with the requirements of a recognised document and indicates it is suitable for its intended purpose and use. These may be in addition to, but not conflict with, CE marking. Note: materials which are not certified by an independent scheme might still conform to a relevant standard. And then 116 says this: accreditation of a certification body by a national accreditation body belonging to the European Cooperation for Accreditation, EA, provides a means of demonstrating that their certification scheme can be relied upon. In the UK, most independent certification bodies are accredited by the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, UCAS, which belongs to the EA. It is important to check the scope of the accreditation of a certification body, as accreditation might only cover part of the certification body's testing or certification business. Now, are you able to explain how those independent certification schemes are relevant to whether the NHBC should have been accepting K15 as part of an external wall build-up based on a confirmation letter from Kingspan?
On reading that, if it was solely from the confirmation of Kingspan, I can see how you can say that.
Yeah.
Yes.
You can say no, I think. Yes. And there's nothing about these schemes which cuts across or undermines, is there, the need to comply with the functional requirement B4 of the building regulations on external fire spread?
No.
No. And it's not right, is it, that you can satisfy yourself that a product or material complies with the requirements of Section 12 of ADB merely by relying on a certificate from an accredited certification body which directs you back to the manufacturer? And then, in turn, rely on what the manufacturer tells you?
The assumption would have been that BBA were satisfied when they made that statement in their certificate that on buildings over 18 metres they would be satisfied that builders could go back to the manufacturer.
Did the absurdity of that conclusion not strike you at the time?
At the time I started to look at this issue in 2013, yes, that's why I raised questions with Kingspan.
But never before that?
Never before that, no. Personally.
In fact, if we go back to the BBA certificate, please, at BBA 6038. Yes, thank you. And please go back, please go to page 6. You can see at 7.3 it says, in buildings with a floor more than 18 metres above ground level, advice should be sought from the certificate holder. Advice. It doesn't, does it, say that the certificate holder could approve the use of K15 in external wall build-ups, which diverged from the build-up tested as described in 7.1, does it?
It doesn't, no.
No. So how could the NHBC possibly have it?
I think the whole industry accepted the BBA certificate on that basis. It wasn't just NHBC, all building control bodies, as we've seen.
Did you know of any other building control body that interpreted the BBA certificate in that way and followed the same practice?
Many of my colleagues, myself included, would have worked for other approved inspectors or other local authorities, other building control bodies before they came to NHBC, and would have brought that custom and practice with them.
Given the market share that NHBC had and its influence in the industry, why was NHBC content to follow what other building control officers were doing? Why wasn't it taking a lead on this?
We did start to take a lead on that in 2013.
In 2013, yes. Some 6 years after, or 5 years after the issue of this certificate. And for some years after K15 was being applied routinely above 18 metres in build-ups different from the one covered by the certificate. Yes?
Yes, but we did take a lead.
Are you sure that Regulation 7 was really the basis of the approach you'd been taking up to 2013, as opposed to an ex post facto rationalisation?
Sorry, can you rephrase that?
Yes. Are you sure, Mr. Evans, as you sit here today, that Regulation 7 was really the thinking that led you to accept Kingspan's say-so in relation to K15 above 18 metres? Or is this just an after-the-fact rationalisation?
Throughout my building control career, I've always accepted BBA certificates for materials as demonstrating compliance. So it's not there was no thought in terms of that. It was purely simply, it's custom and practice within building control that a third-party certification for a material verifies its use in those circumstances.
Do you accept that a builder couldn't comply with the provisions of sections 12.5 to 12.9 of approved document B by leaving it to the manufacturer to bless the use of a combustible product above 18 metres on a case-by-case basis?
I accept that in order for the builder to demonstrate compliance for that, the use of that material above 18 metres, that they needed to seek advice from the certificate holder.
No, that's not my question. Let me try it slightly differently. Do you accept that simply by going to the manufacturer and asking them whether it's okay, as opposed to complying with the provisions of 12.5 to 12.9 of approved document B, do you accept that by doing that, you are setting the whole regulatory regime at naught?
I can see how that can appear, yes.
Now, we've been through in detail to date the concerns that your colleagues at NHBC were raising as early as August 2013, which culminated with the meeting in Wintec and then the genesis of what became Technical Guidance Note 18. There's no mention in anything we've seen so far about Kingspan's advice being sought on each build-up, anywhere in those discussions that we've seen in the documents. Casting your mind back, do you know whether there was any internal discussion at NHBC about what approvals or what advice had been given by Kingspan in relation to build-ups above 18 metres that diverged from the build-up we see described at 7.1 of the certificate?
Sorry, I'm just going to clarify. There is a certificate for Kingspan K15 dated 2010. There is a revision on this certificate dating to 2010.
Yes.
So could we look at that, because that
Certainly.
does actually.
Yeah, I'll show it to you now. It's BBA 6037. Right, this is the one. Forgive me, Mr. Evans, if this isn't the document that you're after. This is 084582. And if you look at the foot of the page,
Yeah.
27th of October 2008, certificate amended 6th of April 2010.
Yes.
You see that?
Yes.
Now, that certificate was published, in fact, by the BBA on the 12th of July 2013. We've established that already. And for those who want to see the evidence in support of that, and I can certainly show you, Mr. Evans, it's John Albon's statement, BBA 3010751, paragraph 12, bottom of page 15. Would you like to see it?
No, I'm confused because when I was looking at the certificate in 2013, this was the certificate I was looking at. And that certificate, this certificate, if we can go to the relevant section within the certificate, which then refers to the behaviour in relation to fire, that specifically includes reference to paragraph 12.7.
It does. Page 5. Let's go there. Now you can see there it is, 7.2. Well, to start, 7.7, behaviour in relation to fire. 7.1 is class 0. And then 7.2, in buildings with a floor more than 18 metres above ground level, advice should be sought from the certificate holder. So that's still there, you see?
Yep.
And then 7.5 deals with the fire tests. But if you look back up at 7.1, I've shown you the scheme of it. 7.1 under England and Wales says approved document B, paragraph 8.4, volume 1, and paragraphs 12.5, 12.6, and 12.7, volume 2. See also diagram 40. You see that?
I do, yes. So my understanding was that this was published in 2010. So when I began looking at the certificate in 2013, when I started to look at this issue, this was the certificate I was referring back to. So in my statement, where I'm making statements about the BBA certificate, this is the certificate I'm referring to.
I understand. Did you not want to see the certificates earlier than 2013?
No, well, yes, but in terms of my witness statement and my involvement with the combustible insulation issue, that began in 2013, and this was the relevant certificate at that time. So,
yes, I follow that. Now, let's then work on the basis, as you've told us, that you, when you first came to this problem, were looking at this piece of paper, this document.
Yeah.
Let's just take it in stages then. First, as I've shown you, you can see that it still retains at 7.2 the requirement for advice to be sought from the certificate holder. Yes? So you saw that at the time.
Yeah.
And looking at 7.1 as we have, it includes, for the first time, but you're perhaps not to know that at this stage, 12.7. Now, presumably, is this right, that you knew in July 2013, when you first saw this document, that clause 12.7 of ADB provides that an insulation material must be of limited combustibility as defined if it's to be used in external wall constructions higher than 18 metres?
Yes.
You must have known that.
Yes.
Right. And did you notice the presence of 12.7 when you first saw this document?
Yes.
What did you think it was doing there?
The question I asked myself at that time was, why are BBA making that statement?
And was that because you knew that as a phenolic product, K15 was most certainly not a material of limited combustibility and as such could never satisfy 12.7? My
view was the information I had at that time, my understanding was it wasn't a material of limited combustibility.
Well, it not only wasn't, couldn't be, because it was phenolic.
That was why I asked the question to be asked of Kingspan, what information are they provided to BBA for BBA to seemingly, from this certificate, be classing it as a material of limited combustibility, or allowing its use in situations where insulation needed to be a material of limited combustibility.
Yeah. But it's not really a question which can admit of any answer other than it's an error, surely.
Well, as a technical person, I like to establish the facts before I make an instant reaction.
Well, all right. But had you ever come across a phenolic product which was a material of limited combustibility?
At that time, no.
No. Now, Chris Hunt of the BBA told us, and for those who want to see it, it's day 109 at page 58, that he thought the introduction of the reference to 12.7 there was to indicate the acceptability of K15 within a masonry cavity wall construction by way of exception to the application of 12.7. I take it from your answers up to this point that that was not something that the NHBC understood at the time.
I don't think it was NHBC's or the industry's interpretation of that at that time.
No, thank you. Now, it's extremely difficult, isn't it, to extract that meaning from the bald reference to 12.7?
It is.
Yes. Did you contact the BBA about this obvious error?
I didn't. At first, I requested John Lewis to contact Kingspan.
Right. I mean, given the prominence you've given in your statement to Regulation 7, and given the prominence you've given in your evidence to the reliance on the certificate in accepting Kingspan above 18 metres, why didn't the NHBC get straight on to the BBA and ask them what 12.7 was doing in this certificate?
My chosen route was to approach Kingspan at that time.
Why?
I felt I wanted from Kingspan the information that they'd provided with BBA. They'd provided to BBA for BBA to make that statement.
But you weren't relying on Kingspan. Well, you were, but you were relying primarily on the certificate. And so why not go as your first port of call to the BBA and say, surely 12.7 is a mistake. Can you just explain it to me?
At that time, I didn't know it was a mistake.
You must have known it was a mistake, with great respect. This is a phenolic product. Couldn't possibly be a material of limited combustibility.
At that time, I didn't know it was a mistake. I wanted to understand why BBA had put that in there. So I felt by approaching Kingspan, or we felt by approaching Kingspan, they would be able to provide us with that information. In fact, they may be able to provide us with more information that demonstrated how it could be used in those circumstances.
Did the NHBC change its acceptance of K15 based on the inclusion of 12.7 in this certificate?
I don't think so, no. I don't understand the question, sorry.
Well, did the NHBC, now seeing that 12.7 was there in this certificate on which NHBC had historically relied, then say to itself, well, that's all right, we can accept K15 above 18 metres without any test data at all?
The way our interpretation of the BBA certificate was that providing advice was sought from the certificate holder, the material could be used over 18 metres and satisfied the building regulations in accordance with 12.5, 12.6 and 12.7.
Well, let's see then how this develops within NHBC. I'd like to look at what guidance you gave to your technical staff in December 2013. So before while the 7.2 in this certificate was still there, that said advice should be sought from the certificate holder. I'd like to look at that. Now, can we go please to NHB 50615? So what I'm looking at, to be clear with you, Mr. Evans, is the period between the introduction of 12.7 in 7.1 and the removal in the next edition of the BBA certificate of the reference to contact the manufacturer, which happened in the December of that year. So we're looking at that 5-month period. And this email run is within that period. Do you see? It's early December 2013.
Yes.
And if we go to the bottom of the chain halfway down page 2, we can see your email to John Lewis of the 2nd of December 2013. Use of Kingspan Cool Therm K15 rain screen board. Hi, John. Hope you had a good weekend. I'm proposing to send the email below to all technical staff today, as this was discussed at length last week at the managers' meeting. Any comments? And then there's the draft in italics. Dear all, there has recently been some confusion in respect of the use of Kingspan Cool Therm K15 rain screen board in buildings over 18 metres in height. The confusion has arisen in respect of whether the material can be treated as a material of limited combustibility. The product has a current BBA certificate attached, which indicates that it is acceptable for use in accordance with Approved Document B, Volume 2, Paragraph 12.7, 7.1. The BBA certificate does seem to qualify this, however, by then going on to say that in situations over 18 metres, advice should be sought from the certificate holder. 7.2. We are currently investigating this with Kingspan, and we are awaiting a response from them. However, until we are in a position to say otherwise, NHBC BCS's current policy is to accept the use of this material in rain screen and masonry construction over 18 metres. Now, just pausing there, when you contacted Kingspan asking for approvals or advice on build-ups over 18 metres, as the certificate suggested, after July 2013, did you ask them at the same time why it was that the BBA certificate suggested that K15 could be used in accordance with 12.7?
So there would have been our contact with Kingspan was direct to furnish ourselves with the information that they provided to the BBA. It was the builders that would have contacted them in terms of the individual projects.
Right. Did you advise your members that when they were contacting the manufacturer, as per this certificate, they should also ask them what 12.7 was doing in there?
No.
Why not? That would have been the obvious thing to do, at least as a starting point.
No, we were approaching the manufacturer direct for that information. So our conversation at my level was with directly with Kingspan.
And in the meantime, your BCS were accepting, in other words, approving the use of Kingspan in external wall build-ups over 18 metres, even though it was not a material of limited combustibility.
So we were accepting it in accordance with its BBA certificate, where it was used in accordance with the BBA certificate.
Which was obviously wrong.
Which we had questions about at that time.
Well, yes, now, you say that. I mean, can you explain what the questions were, other than how on earth could a phenolic insulation board, which is combustible, comply with clause 12.7?
That's the question we posed to Kingspan at that time.
But as I said to you before, now I invite you to accept it, there is no answer to that question other than it doesn't.
In hindsight, no, it doesn't. With
But
the
why
information we have now.
hindsight?
Well, at the time, in our mind, there had to be a reason why BBA were making that statement. That Kingspan must have provided them with information at that time in order to make that statement. What we wanted to understand was what information had they provided? What information had they got, which we hadn't, which allowed them to make that statement?
Limited combustibility is a description of a product which can be applied as a result of a test, isn't it?
It is.
And the test could either be under the Euro tests, 13501, EN 13501, or else BS 476 Part 11, I think. Yes?
Yes.
You'll know that, won't you? There's nothing in this certificate, we can go back to it, to tell you that Kingspan K15 has passed either of those tests or sets of tests, is there?
No, not within the certificate, no.
And therefore, I'll put it to you one more time. It must have been manifest to you at the time that the reference to 12.7 can only have been a mistake. By whom, it doesn't matter. It was unreliable. No?
At that time, I wanted to find out what information had been provided to see if it was a mistake.
Well,
I hadn't at that time. I hadn't made a judgment as whether it was a mistake or not.
How do you?
I wanted to find information. I wanted further information. I didn't understand enough about Kingspan itself, the material. I assumed it was a PIR PUR insulation, which wasn't a material of limited combustibility, but perhaps there was something that I didn't know, which meant it could be, and that was why at that stage we asked those questions.
Let's go to the next email up in the chain. We can see John Lewis's response. This is page 1, second email down. John Lewis, Steve Evans, 2nd December, Hello, Steve. You see that?
I do.
And then I'm not too sure about this one. I think it would be better to wait until Kingspan clarify things. I don't agree that there's confusion about the MOLC classification. This type of insulation board is combustible and doesn't meet the MOLC classification. BBA certificate paragraph 7.1 is referring to its class 0 rating, not its LC properties. It's badly worded, but I still don't think it implies that K15 is a MOLC, material of limited combustibility. Paragraph 7.2 states that reference needs to be made back to Kingspan before accepting it in a building above 18 metres. So, if we send out an email to all staff, I think we should state that whilst we are obliged to accept it in principle, it is a requirement of the client to obtain this advice from Kingspan and present it to us before we can formally accept it in the situation proposed. And then he writes, or rewrites, the suggested guidance in his email, and you can see the text in italics, which includes, if you look at the last paragraph over the page, it says this: until we are in a position to say otherwise, NHBC's BCS's current policy is to accept in principle the use of this material in rain screen and masonry construction over 18 metres, subject to the necessary advice from Kingspan being received and approved by us for each system build-up. And then he goes on at the end. The trouble is that I don't think Kingspan will be able to come up with the required goods, but at least we've dug into it a bit deeper. Now, why were the NHBC obliged, it's his words, obliged to accept the advice in principle?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question?
Yes. Let's go back then to the third paragraph on page 1. He says in the second line, I think we should state that whilst we are obliged to accept it in principle, it's a requirement of the client to obtain this advice from Kingspan. And my question is, why was NHBC obliged to accept the advice in principle?
Because it would have been used if we had the advice from Kingspan, then it met the conditions of its BBA certificate. So as a building control body, we could accept that. And if we didn't accept that, that could realistically be then challenged by the builder.
Well, only if, in fact, there had been actual compliance with the building regulations which the building control officer had refused to accept, surely.
So as a building control body, we can't set conditions over and above the building regulations. The building regulations, in this case, allow for a material which is as a third-party certification. If the builder meets the conditions under that third-party certification, then we, as a building control body, we accept that. If we were to set the conditions any higher, that would be ultra vires to our position.
You're not obliged to accept a statement which is palpably wrong, are you? You're not obliged to accept a statement by the BBA that K15 met the requirements of 12.7 when it didn't.
Well, again, this is why we started to ask questions. So we had questions clearly at this time, but the conditions at that point in time was that the material had a BBA certificate, which the builder could demonstrate they had obtained the appropriate conditions to fulfil that BBA certificate. The fact that we started to ask questions of Kingspan in terms of that is demonstrating that we were starting to question why those statements were on the certificate.
But despite the inclusion of 12.7 here in the certificate, John Lewis wasn't confused about the combustibility of K15, was he? He's made it very clear to you in the email back to you of the same day that there isn't any confusion. K15 is combustible and is not a MOLC. So there's no confusion there.
And I agreed with him. My personal view is that I agreed with him. It wasn't a material of limited combustibility, but the statements that were made in the BBA certificate were confusing. So you can see why some of our builder customers were, when questioned, putting it forward as a material of limited combustibility.
Can we take it from this email that the NHBC was still accepting the use of K15 in external facades at this time, provided it had a letter from Kingspan saying it was okay?
Providing it was being used in accordance with the BBA certificate, yes.
Well, you say that. That's not an answer to my question. You say provided it was being used in accordance with the BBA certificate, which said two things. First of all, that it was a material of limited combustibility. Yes? And secondly, seek advice from the manufacturer.
The certificate...
Which bit are you referring to?
So the certificate says that... so our interpretation of the certificate was that the material satisfied the conditions in 12.5, 12.6 and 12.7, and that providing, and the buildings over 18 metres, providing it was referred to, that advice was sought from the manufacturer, it could be used in those positions.
What?
It wasn't we weren't approving it as a material of limited combustibility. We were accepting it in that position because it had third-party certification saying it could be used in that position.
What was the point of going back to the manufacturer if it was a material of limited combustibility?
I don't think I've said it's a material of limited combustibility.
No, but the certificate does, you see.
No.
Well, let me try the question in a different way, to be fair to you. Did you ever think to yourself, or ask yourself the question, what is the purpose of seeking advice from the manufacturer if, as this certificate says, K15 is a material of limited combustibility?
And that is why we started to ask questions.
Now, the BBA certificate was reissued on the 17th of December 2013, only a few weeks after this exchange. Let's go to that. Well, we'll come to it in a moment. Take it from me. Take it from me that the contact the manufacturer clause and the reference to 12.7 came out.
Yes.
What I want to show you then is an email chain at NHB 50689, and this is February 2014, so the story is moving on. And if we start with Dave White's email to Kingspan at the foot of page 3, please. That says, this is the 24th of February, to Richard Bromwich and Ivor Meredith, copied to you and John Lewis, as well as Graham Perrior. Fire performance of Kingspan K15 insulation on external walls over 18 metres. Hi, hello, Richard. We are still dealing with individual NHBC registered projects where it appears that Kingspan K15 insulation board is being recommended for use on residential buildings where stories exceed 18 metres and the walls are of framed construction. I think that we established and agreed at our meeting in January that the K15 insulation product had only been tested for fire performance to BS 8414, where K15 boards are installed using direct mechanical fixing onto a solid masonry blockwork backing wall. And then if you turn the page, please could you read the attached memo which explains our concerns with regard to the recent reissue of BBA Certificate 084582. We would very much appreciate a response to these concerns and any update that you can provide on further accredited testing that may be underway. Now, by that time, so this is late February 2014, is it fair to say that you were now concerned about how it had come about historically that K15 was being used so widely and on a wide variety of external wall build-ups over 18 metres?
Yes.
Yes. Now, the next day, 25th of February 2014, I think it's right that you ask John Lewis to assess the new BBA certificate against your BC policy. If we go up to page 3, we see that. Sorry, page. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. My fault. Page 2. I have it at page 2. I think you may need page 3. 25th of February 2014. Hi, Dave. Can you forward a copy of the BBA certificate that you've referred to in the memo? John, can you assess the new certificate against RBC policy as set out in my email of 27th of January 2014? And then if we go to the top email in the chain on page 1 from John Lewis to you of the 9th of May 2014, you can see it sits at the top of this chain. And he says, hello, Steve, I've taken a look at the current BBA certificate. The relevant bit is extracted below. And we'll come back to look at the substance in just a moment. But my first question is, do you know why it took him 2.5 months to come back to you?
I don't know.
Did you chase him?
I may have done, I can't remember.
Do you know why it doesn't appear on the face of it to have been more urgent?
At the time, we were also meeting with Kingspan. That's the only reason I can imagine, or other things on. I don't know.
Yes. Now let's look at the substance. He says this, hello, Steve. I've taken a look and I've shown you that. And then he adds the behaviour in relation to fire section to the email, which details the build-up from the successful BS8414 test. And we see in the smaller text at point 1, if you see down very small underneath 8.2, there's a little paragraph 1. You see that?
Yep.
It says the test result relates only to this specific construction, and a separate test would be required to establish the performance of any other combination of materials. That's an extract from the certificate. And then underneath that, clause 8.3, the product incorporated in the construction defined in section 8.2 can be used in buildings with a floor more than 18 metres above ground level. Fire breaks should be used at every floor level after the first floor. And then he says, I'm not actually sure how we can justify accepting it, ! Even the bit about an assessment by Kingspan has been removed, and the words now say that any other combination of materials needs a separate test, and the test is to BS8414 Part 1, which is specific to masonry walls. Can we discuss on Monday? Now, we can't see a response to that email from you in the documents. Looking back on it, do you remember, did you agree with his assessment?
In terms of the new certificate, yes.
You did?
Yes.
What happened within Nhbc by way of reaction to his analysis and your agreement with it?
So at this point, we were meeting with Kingspan and asking them to undertake further tests or provide further justification to verify its use over 18 metres.
Did you stop accepting K15 as of May 2014, given that it was not in line with the wording of the BBA certificate?
Not at that stage. The date of submission of the initial notice or full plans application ties in the regulations and the certification that can be used in assessing that scheme. So at this point in May, we set up. I'd confirmed at the beginning of December the conditions under which we would accept K15 in accordance with its BBA certificate. We've looked at that, or we've looked at the email that developed that circular that went around. So at this point, a lot of the buildings that would so up until this new certificate was issued, the previous BBA certificate would have been in force. At this point, the buildings that were being designed would have not reached construction stage, so there was still time to work with industry to find a way of demonstrating compliance, or for builders to be able to demonstrate compliance if they wanted to use this material.
Why did you not immediately stop accepting K15 at that point, in respect of even only projects going forward?
At this time, we were working with Kingspan and industry to identify how, if builders wanted to use this material, they could demonstrate compliance. And at this point, the communication with Kingspan was that they were going to be able to provide that information. So we haven't started looking at the meetings we've had with Kingspan as yet. But at this point, we'd had at least 2 meetings with Kingspan where they had acknowledged the fact that the material was not a material of limited combustibility, had acknowledged the fact that it could only be used in one position, but they were discussing and expressing the desire to undertake further testing and analysis to demonstrate to the industry that it could be used in those positions.
Well, you'd met them in the January 2014. Did you ask them at the time, how come the BBA certificate had, until the previous month, December 2013, said that K15 complied with 12.7 of ADB?
So when we initially met them in January, I wasn't aware at that point that the certificate had changed 2013. At that point, I was still under the impression that the BBA certificate from 6th of April 2010 was in force. And we asked them for information that they'd provided to BBA in order for BBA to make those statements.
Sorry, let me be clear. You asked them, is this right, in January 2014?
Yes.
For the information that they had given to the BBA to enable the BBA to certify that K15 was a material of limited combustibility?
To certify, so BBA could make the statement that it could be used to satisfy 12.7.
Right.
I don't think the certificate actually says it's a material of limited combustibility in those words.
It says it complies with 12.7.
It says it can be used to satisfy paragraph 12.7. So the certificate doesn't actually say it's a material of limited combustibility. It creates confusion around whether it is a material of limited combustibility or not.
Let me try the question a slightly different way then, given that you're making that distinction, if it is a distinction. Did you ask Kingspan for an explanation how 12.7 came to be referred to in clause or section 7.1 of the BBA certificate that had existed until December 2013?
I believe we did at that meeting.
And what did they tell you?
They said they had testing. They had testing that established that.
They told you they had testing that established
they had further tests which they weren't referred to in the certificate that they could show us and furnish us with, and that they were also going to be undertaking further testing to demonstrate that that material could be used over 18 metres.
There's a difference, isn't there, between further testing under 8414 down the track and showing you test results demonstrating compliance with 12.7. What did they tell you at that meeting about how it came about that the BBA certified K15 as compliant with 12.7?
They didn't give me any information at that meeting to verify that.
Why did you not press them for that?
We did press them for that. We asked them to provide us with that information. We asked them, they also undertook to take further tests, which at that point they seemed genuine in doing so. So there was no reason to suspect that that wasn't going to happen.
You say they didn't give you any information at the meeting. Did they answer your question? The simple question, what is 12.7 doing in the certificate? Did they answer the question?
I can't recall if they did.
Did you actually ask it?
We asked, I don't know. I don't think we did ask why is 12.7 in that certificate.
Why not?
I think we had a discussion around whether Kingspan was a material of limited combustibility, or K15 specifically was a material of limited combustibility.
You've explained how historically Nhbc had relied on previous versions of the BBA certificate for K15 and followed the instructions in it to get advice from the manufacturer. Once the certificate was amended, clarifying the narrow basis on which K15 could be used above 18 metres, as it was in December 2013, why, after that, did Nhbc not follow the guidance and refuse to accept K15 unless it was used in cladding, tested successfully under BS 8414, or else in a system identical to that which had been tested by Kingspan on a masonry wall?
So the reason that we didn't take a knee-jerk reaction in stopping at that point to say K15 could not be used was because in dialogue with the manufacturer at that time, they were seemingly going to be working with us, an industry, to be able to generate the information, to provide the information, which demonstrated how that could be used.
Presumably, given the now clear and now narrow scope of the BBA certificate for K15 above 18 metres, nobody thought within NHBC that you could rely on the BBA certificate for any wider application.
No, and that was our thinking. The certificate, the revised certificate, was quite clear that K15 could only be used in one application.
Yeah.
It was quite clear. However, the conversations with the manufacturer was that they were going to be able to provide us with further information in a short space of time that would satisfy us that it could be used in either a range of different situations, or could actually be used without further justification over 18 metres. And it seemed at that point that they were seemingly wanting to work with us. If we'd taken a knee-jerk reaction and said we're not accepting it on any building which is presently under design or build, or indeed new build, that would have meant at that point a great deal of upheaval for those designers, builders, for the industry as a whole, which could, in 3 months' time, have actually been demonstrated was the wrong action. So taken that these buildings actually take a great deal of time to actually design and get to site, you've got something like 18 months from starting to design a building to actually getting it onto site to start to build. There was time to actually allow industry to do that research, to provide that information.
Do you accept that once the terms of the BBA certificate had been narrowed, there was no certified basis for justifying the use of K15 above 18 metres other than the promises of future tests given to you by Kingspan?
At that time, as a building control body, we wouldn't have been issuing final certificates on schemes which were subject to the new BBA certificate. So it's not until we actually issue the final certificate at the end of the job where we're saying we've discharged our functions as an approved inspector, and as far as we can tell, using professional skill and judgment, that as far as we're aware, that building complies with the building regulations. We had time to work with Kingspan to actually develop that understanding to see if it could be used over 18 metres.
Yes, and until that happened, in that open-ended time frame, until that happened, there was no basis whatever for NHBC accepting the use of K15 in external build-ups over 18 metres.
At that point, for those new buildings coming in, so those buildings which are subject to the new, so those submitted after the 1st of January, or after the new certificate came in, at that point we weren't accepting it because they were still it was a design intention at that time. It was a design intention of those designers to use K15. So we would have been asking two avenues of trying to furnish ourselves with the necessary information. We would have been asking the builder to demonstrate compliance, but we also were dealing and communicating with Kingspan, who, on the early meetings we had with them, were quite convincing in telling us that they were going to be able to provide this information. So that by the time we actually started to build these buildings on site and actually came to issuing our final certificate, we would at that point have had that information in place.
Well, only if it had proved correct.
Only if it had proven correct, yes.
So, if a builder came to you on the 9th of May and said, please approve my new build,
Yep.
Which on a steel frame, over 18 metres using Kingspan K15, what would the NHBC have said?
At that point, if they'd have come to us on the 9th of May with a building over 18 metres and asked us to issue the final certificate, the likelihood is that would have been submitted prior to the change in the BBA certificate. And so the previous certificate would have been in place. And had they had the necessary information from Kingspan to verify compliance, we would have issued the final certificate at that point.
What information?
So the information from Kingspan verifying that they'd looked at the design and they, in their view, it was suitable for over 18 metres.
I suggest to you, though, you were blowing hot and cold, weren't you? You were relying on the BBA certificate right up until December 2013 to allow Kingspan K15 above 18 metres. But when it suddenly narrows and says you can't use it unless it's exactly in accordance with the 8414 masonry build-up, you don't suddenly suspend or stop the approvals. You wait for, or as you put it, you working with Kingspan to try to find a way. Why is that?
No, so the discussions that we've had, so legally, when trying to think how to put this, actually get the timeline in place. So up until when the certificate was changed in December, the previous BBA certificate was in force. And at that point, the conversations, so that ties in those regulations and that certificate for that particular building. In May, we would still been having design conversations with the designers of those buildings prior to that. So we wouldn't actually be starting to have conversations with many builders that were subject to the new certificate in May and June time. We would have still been, because these buildings take a great deal of time to actually design and then build, your design conversations we were having with May with a number of these builders would have actually been in relation to the previous BBA certificate.
I mean, instead of refusing K15 on untested build-ups, you were really looking for a way of justifying their continued use. Its continued use, weren't you?
We weren't, sorry, Nhbc weren't looking for a way. Nhbc were looking for the manufacturer to be able to provide to their builder customers information to demonstrate compliance.
Why are you prepared to take the risk of working with Kingspan if, in fact, as the BBA certificate said as of December 2013, 12.7 was no longer a route to compliance, and nor was seeking approval from the manufacturer? Why not simply suspend all approvals of the use of K15 above 18 metres until you had some new test data?
As I say, a knee-jerk reaction to stop the use of that material without having all the information, which is where we were at that time, would have caused a great deal of difficulty for a number of our customers who are at various stages of design. When actually, had Kingspan been able to give us that information, would have actually, not justified us not accepting it earlier.
Well, you met them in January. This is May. 5 months has gone by. That's not a knee-jerk reaction, is it?
So Kingspan were telling us that they would undertake more fire tests. Those fire tests can take up to 6-8 months to arrange. So, these are full-scale. The 8414 test is a full-scale test. Right. In terms of, there was only at that time limited facilities in the country to be able to undertake that test. So generally at BRE, I think there was a test rig up in Warrington as well. Booking that test rig could take there could be a 3 to 4, 5 month waiting list to get that test rig.
Yeah.
You then had to get in to actually build the sample and then burn it, and then it could take another couple of months to get the results.
Yeah.
So the timescale that Kingspan were talking about when we first met them in January and then in April was not an unreasonable, from our perspective, an unreasonable timescale for them to be able to undertake that test and give us the results. And in our view, at that time, by the time we'd got those results, by the time we got the justification that they were promising us they would be able to provide, the buildings which were presently being submitted and going through the design stage would not have reached the stage where we had to issue our final certificate.
But you didn't know that in respect of any particular building, did you? You didn't know what might come in.
I didn't know what would come in, no, but in terms of our final certificate, which is actually when we verify that the building, as far as we're able to tell using professional skill and care, meets the building regulations, at that point, at this point in May, for these buildings that would be affected, could be another 12, 18 months away.
I mean, did it not occur to you at the time that really this was a very soft and lax approach to fire safety, and that really, in effect, you'd been captured by Kingspan and were being used by them as your poodles?
No, I don't believe that's the case at all. We had one test which had demonstrated the material could be used over 18 metres. There was no evidence at this point that Kingspan would not be able to provide further testing to demonstrate that. So it was a case of working with industry as a whole to allow industry to provide that information.
So letting industry take the lead and not NHBC as, you might think, the guardians of the highest standards of fire safety.
I think the work we were doing in working with Kingspan was part of that role in raising standards and preserving fire safety.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Well, I think it's time we had a break for the afternoon, Mr. Evans. We'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 4. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 25 to 4, please. Would you ask Mr. Evans to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Evans, all ready to carry on, I hope.
Yes, no problem.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Evans, looking back at the time, 2013, early 2014, was Kingspan's K15 the only combustible insulation material being used in external cladding facades above 18 metres? Do you remember? Or were there others?
There were others, yes.
Who were the others? What were the others?
The others that I'm aware of would be the Celetex RS5000.
In late 13? That was only tested on the 2nd of May 2014, apparently successful.
Perhaps not then, sorry. I'm getting my dates mixed up,
Right.
sorry.
Can you think of any others?
I can't, no.
Right. Do you remember that in November 2013, Celetex contacted NHBC to ask for their views about the use of their FR5000 insulation product, another combustible insulation? Do you remember that?
I'm aware that they contacted NHBC, yes.
I think it's right that Dave White and Graham Perrior were the people in NHBC who dealt in the main with Celetex.
Yes.
Would that be
that's
right?
Yeah.
Were you aware that Celetex was contacting NHBC, asking for their advice on standards in order to allow them to tailor their testing of what was their FR5000 in order to relaunch it as RS5000? Do you remember?
I can't remember if at that time I was aware. No.
Now, we know that the product was tested twice, in fact, in February and in May 2014, and purportedly passed a large-scale fire test under BS 8414 Part 2, so steel, on the 2nd of May, and the results were reported by BRE to have satisfied the BR 135 criteria. Do you remember that?
I'm aware of that test, yes.
Yes. And were you aware that before that test they had failed, or RS5000 had failed a BS 8414 test in February 2014?
I wasn't aware at that time, no.
Let's go to NHB 50748. This is an email chain from August 2014, at the time when RS5000 was launched onto the market. That's a long chain. We need only go to the fourth email down, page 3, which is the 8th of August 2014 email, at the foot of the page, from Noel Pells to you. Noel Pells is a project manager in the Technical Services Division. And he says, Steve, you see this, he says, Steve, as discussed, see email below and the following link, which is a Celetex website, products RS5000. As I mentioned, there is nothing on the BBA website at the moment, but the email below suggests there is a BBA. I've asked Nigel Shields at Durcan for further info, and there's an email below that. Now, if we go up to the next email in the chain, we can see that you, having received this email from Noel Pells, send it on to Dave White, Graham Perrior, and John Lewis. Hi all, Noel has found this product, at the foot of your screen there. Noel has found this product. We can't find a BBA certificate at present, but it claims to have had a test making it suitable over 18 metres, although I suspect this is the same as K15, only in the configuration tested. And then if you go to the response from John Lewis at the bottom of page 1 on the 12th of August 2014, 1649, he says, hello, Steve. And then if we go to the top of page 2, he says, the most noticeable thing is the use of non-combustible fire cement panels on the external face, but at least so they claim it's tested on a steel supporting structure and not a masonry wall. Well, I guess that's a step forward from the situation with K15. Now, a step forward. Was it a step forward, as John Lewis puts it? Because most of the buildings, if not all of the buildings, you were providing warranty and building control services for were those with a structural steel frame.
I believe what John would have meant at that time, the way I took it, would that we now had a test which demonstrated that a material of limited combustibility could be tested and shown to pass a test in with an 8414-2 test, yes.
Yeah. But you'd never seen a BS 8414 Part 2 test satisfying the R135 for K15?
Not at that point, no.
Right. Now, at the very top of the chain, 13th of August 2014, we can see that Dave White responds to those on the chain. And you're one of those recipients of this email, 13th of August, and he says this. Hello, John. Graham and I are currently reviewing a fire test report and supporting information provided by Celetex for this product. We recently had a meeting at their factory premises and have since reviewed a final version of the BRE fire test report. However, the sample test as reported was a wall type with a very robust construction, i.e. the thickest boards were specified for both the rain screen and a fire-resistant magnesium oxide backing board fixed as sheathing behind the Celetex insulation product. I think that once we have had time to look at this in standards and technical, it would be useful to discuss with you and Steve. Meanwhile, if you want to read the report, just let me know and I will forward it to you. We should deal with the fire test information as commercial in confidence at the moment. Now, I want, just having shown you that, to show you an extract from Dave White's review of the BRE fire test report for RS5000 and his subsequent correspondence with John Roper at Celetex. Can we go to NHB 50784? And if we go to the second page, please, in the email run, this is a letter dated the 29th of September 2014. And if you go to the first paragraph down on page 2, you can see that Dave White says this at the top of your screen. At our previous meetings, I took care when explaining the limitations in testing fire performance of any wall type, where the key details were not representative of typical actual facade systems. This included some constructive feedback on your initial prototype drawings. However, when we finally saw that the actual test has included some very large format, thick cladding boards and unusual detailing, the immediate comment was that this test installation was not sufficiently representative of typical rain screen designs normally found on high-rise residential buildings. Whilst this arrangement was resistant to early temperature rise within upper storey levels, the overall fire behaviour indicated that the facade had only limited fire resistance and continued to burn extensively in excess of 30 minutes. And if we then go to the third paragraph from the bottom, he says this. In terms of NHBC acceptance, our technical view is that the fire performance of Celetex insulation shows limitations in the actual fire resistance, relying heavily on a specific and unusual facade construction type, including thickness and layout of key parts of the cladding system to provide partial fire resistance. Now, just pausing there. Why do you remember? Did you discuss this test with John Lewis and Dave White?
I can't remember if I did.
Did you know anything of the build-up that Celetex had used to get RS5000 past the BS8414 Part 2 test?
Only what I'd read in Dave's email.
Oh, I see. Did you know about it at the time?
Not when they undertook the test, no.
Right. Did you have a view at the time as to whether or not the RS5000 build-up, which had apparently passed this test in May 2014, represented external wall build-ups used in real life, on real-life buildings?
I didn't have a view at that time, no.
Now, let's look at Dave White's statement. NHB 403437, please. I just want to show you something that he says. At page 27, paragraph 100. Foot of the page, he says this. Although I had previously explained to Celetex that any test specimen would need to fully represent the typical wall makeup for an external facade wall, they had taken a different approach by testing exceptionally large format, thicker panels with a cladding layout containing very unusual closed joint detailing. This created reductions in conventional spacing dimensions normally used in wall cladding. Therefore, it did not comply with NHBC standards for rain screen walls. Now, do you agree with him that the BS8414 Part 2 test, which Celetex carried out on RS5000 on the 2nd of May 2014, did not comply with NHBC standards for the reasons he said?
I don't think that's what Dave is saying, is it? I think Dave is saying that the test that has passed would achieve NHBC standards because it's passed the test. But I think what Dave is saying is that we wouldn't typically see that type of cladding on buildings. So it would be unusual to see that type of cladding on buildings in terms of that large format panels. So had Celetex been used in the configuration tested on a building, then yes, it would meet NHBC standards.
Can you explain what standards he's referring to there?
So these are NHBC standards rather than the building regulations.
Indeed.
So Dave would be commenting from a standard in terms of NHBC standards rather than building control.
I understand that. And I hesitate before asking you to interpret a witness statement from another witness, but rather than calling him, can you help? Do you agree or do you disagree that the wall makeup with their large format, thicker panels, unusual close joint detailing and consequent reductions in conventional spacing dimensions meant that build-up didn't comply with NHBC standards for rain screen walls?
I'm trying to see why he's saying it doesn't comply with NHBC standards for rain screen walls. It could be another reason, such as the ventilation gap that was used or something like that.
Did the NHBC subsequently allow the use of RS 5000 above 18 metres when conducting building control services on such buildings?
I believe after 2015, our changing policy, yes, we did.
You did?
If it was demonstrated that it was in accordance with BCA Guidance Note 18.
Right. And it's right, isn't it, that because RS 5000 could only be used in the one configuration for which it had passed a BS 8414 Part 2 test, it could only be used above 80 metres in exactly that configuration.
If it was being used and they were going down the route of the 8414 testing route, yes. But obviously, if subsequently the builder provided an option 3, a desktop assessment of that system, then we could accept it if that was the case.
Do you remember whether you discussed this build-up, the build-up that is described at paragraph 100 there, with Dave White at the time?
I didn't know.
You didn't? Were you ever concerned in general that manufacturers were, so to speak, over-engineering facades in order to pass BS 8414 tests?
At the time, I didn't know they were being over-engineered. Obviously, having heard evidence from the inquiry since, then I know that is the case. And had I known at the time, yes, I would have been concerned.
Now, after the successful BS 8414 test for RS 5000, so it appeared, did the NHBC see it being used on buildings over 18 metres? Did it come up?
I would have expected at that time that some of our builders would have put it forward as a possible solution to achieving their thermal requirements of their walls.
I see. And where it differed from the exceptional rig as tested, as described by Mr. White here, what was the basis on which the NHBC would accept it? Was that desktops?
I would imagine so at this time, yes. I'm trying to film out where this fits in with the timeline of what we were doing at the time.
Yes, well, this is 2014 May to August.
Yeah. So we would have been talking to our people, the surveyors, and that would have been talking to the builders if they were proposing to use this product, and unless they were using it in accordance with the test result, then they would have been asking for a desktop assessment, yes.
And by that time, by at least after June 2014, that would have been apparently in accordance with what you came to call option 3 in your technical guidance note.
Yes.
Issue 0.
Yes.
Now let's go back to Kingspan then, early 2014. You told us that you'd met with Kingspan in the January of 2014, yes?
Yes.
And that was after the change to the BBA certificate. Let's go to NHB 50652. This is your update from the meeting that you sent to your technical team, your senior technical team, the following week, the 27th of January 2014. It's from you to the technical services managers, copy to Graham Perrier, Dave White and John Lewis, subject Kingspan update. You see that?
I do.
If you look at the first paragraph, it says, and I'll read much of this to you now. Further to the Technical Services Operations meeting last week, I can provide an update on our dealing with Kingspan, and in particular our position with respect to the use of Kingspan Cooltherm K15 in buildings over 18 metres in height. Myself, Graham Perrier, John Lewis and Dave White met with Richard Bromwich, National Business Development Director, and Ivor Meredith, Project Manager Technical of Kingspan, just over a week ago. The meeting was in response to our approaches at the end of last year. At the meeting, we summarised our position and confirmed the circumstances under which we would be able to accept the use of K15 as detailed in my email of the 2nd of December 2013. In response, Kingspan stated that they have a range of information in existence which they can share with us to demonstrate the capabilities of the product, but agreed that the only conclusive test for the product is the one used to produce the present BBA certification, which was carried out in 2005. They did confirm to us that they've booked test sites at BRE in early March 2014 in order to test K15 to BS8414 Part 1. The tests will allow the product to be tested in a variety of cladding makeups, and therefore provide further evidence for industry to support the use of the material in a wider range of scenarios than presently exists. Kingspan have agreed to share the testing schedule with us, and Nhbc have agreed to make comment if necessary. We have therefore agreed to meet with Richard and Ivor again at the beginning of April to review the information coming out of the tests and how this may affect the use of the material in buildings over 18 metres in height. Therefore, until this meeting, and this is a meeting 3 months down the track, until this meeting, our position in respect of Kingspan Cool 13 K15 remains as per my email dated 2nd of December. And you remember that, and particularly the last paragraph, which you've cited again there at the bottom of the screen, until we are in a position to say otherwise, etc. Now, it's right, isn't it, that at this time, Kingspan had no further large-scale test evidence involving K15 to give you, did they?
They didn't, no.
All that they had was their 2005 test, the details of which were set out in the BBA certificate in accordance with BS 8414 Part 1, masonry substrate. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Did the Nhbc therefore stop approving or underwriting K15 after this meeting in January 2015 until, or unless and until it was used in the exact build-up tested in 2005?
No. At this meeting, we were unaware that the subsequent change to the certificate in December 2003, we were unaware that the certificate had changed at this meeting. It wasn't until after this meeting we were made aware that the certificate had changed. Kingspan didn't tell us the certificate had changed at this meeting. And as I said before, in January, the buildings we were having discussions on in terms of the design, the design is an iterative process. It takes time to develop a design. The builder doesn't necessarily provide you with that's my design, that's what I'm going to build. We will have conversations about what they're intending to do, how they're going to design it, how they're going to solve the various issues around the building regulation, not just fire safety, but thermal, all of those things. The buildings we would have been having conversations, those design conversations at the time, would have still been subject to the previous BBA certificate, which for the previous questioning have explained why we accepted that BBA certificate. And
that gives rise to two questions. First of all, why didn't you at this stage, late January 2015, write to your customers and say, for the time being, until we have further test data, you may only use K15 above 18 metres if the external wall construction corresponds precisely with the external wall build-up used to pass the 2005 test?
Because at that time, we didn't know that K15 would not be safe in those positions. It may have been that the testing that was being promised by Kingspan would have demonstrated that it could be used. If I'd have written to all my customers at that point and said, we're not going to accept it, that would have caused, at that point, pandemonium in terms of their design solutions, which they've been using for a number of years, or the products they're familiar with. But also, had then Kingspan been able to furnish us with that information in 3, 5, 6 months' time, to then start saying accepted it again, we actually, it doesn't instill confidence in us as a building control body in doing that, does it?
Well, that's a matter of opinion. But I'm interested in what you just said when you said you didn't know that K15 would not be safe in those positions. But is ignorance of the absence of danger a route to compliance?
At this point, the buildings we were talking about in terms of the design, had Kingspan not been able to furnish us with that information, there would have been time to change those designs. Let
me press you again. Just because you didn't know it wasn't safe, why was that an acceptable route? Why was that an acceptable route for Nhbc to proceed on the basis that customers were continuing to be compliant?
But we didn't have information at that time which said it was unsafe either.
But that's, with great respect, there's nothing in ADB, is there, that says that you can put K15 above 18 metres unless you know it's not safe. That's not how the regulation works, is it?
No, but we at this point in January we were in a position where we had a BBA certificate, which meant that it could be accepted, providing the builder demonstrated compliance with that certificate.
Right. Well, here you are, going to the manufacturer, taking advice from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer is not telling you, don't worry, it's material of limited combustibility. Right? Mm. Right? So that's out the window. And is not telling you, don't worry, it can be used on all sorts of build-ups because we've got lots of 8414 tests which carry across into a wide range of build-ups. Mm. He's just telling you they've got the 2005 masonry substrate test, yes?
Yes.
Right. Given that that's all you had to go on, as directed by the certificate you thought was extant at the time, why not simply say there is no evidence on which K15 can safely be used above 18 metres, and therefore there is no evidence to demonstrate compliance with ADB. And until there is, we're suspending approvals and we're not underwriting.
The decision was made to work with industry, to work with Kingspan, to allow them the opportunity to demonstrate to us that it was safe to use in order so that we didn't disrupt the development process.
Well, just help me with this, Mr. Evans. Let's put Mr. Millett's question the other way around. If someone had asked you at this time, how do you justify accepting the use of K15 over 18 metres, what would you have said?
So we had a body, the BBA, who in their certification had verified that it could be used under those conditions over 18 metres. That was the information we had to go on at that time. We knew it could be tested and had demonstrated that it could be tested in one configuration and passed. So the view was that we could work with industry or allow industry to furnish us with further information to demonstrate that it could be safe. But it could be used in further situations.
It sounds to me as though what you're saying is that you only had a clear statement that it was fit for use over 18 metres in a very limited, not even range actually, very limited build-up. But you had no other grounds for accepting it in a different build-up. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So,
we had limited information.
Right, so the answer to my question is you had no supporting material for the use of K15 other in a build-up which was different from the one explicitly described in the BBA certificate.
That's the information we had,
Yeah.
yes.
So I think the question then is, on what basis did you think it was proper to accept its use?
We wanted to get to gain further information to make an informed decision that if it wasn't safe, then it wasn't suitable. Right. Until we had that we didn't have information either way. I suppose we had the information we did have was positive towards the use of the material. We had the BBA certificate and we had one report. We didn't at that time have any information which said, so we had no failed test reports, we had no information that said anything different. So we wanted to, before we actually said we can't use this material, we're not going to accept this material, as we would with other, not just Kingspan, but any other material where we don't have all that information, we would generally try to seek additional information to make sure we had a fully informed case before making that decision.
Thank you. Yes,
that's a going forward question. I want to ask you about the legacy. Did you realise at this point, say late January 2014, that you had an overhang or legacy of up to 9 years, back to 2005, of buildings above 18 metres which might have Kingspan K15 on them in external wall build-up configurations that differed from that which had been tested in 2005?
Of course, as an organisation, we realised that, yes.
And what did you do about it?
Again, it was there was no evidence to prove that it in the situations it had been used, it wasn't safe. There was no evidence to prove that they were either way. We didn't have a test either way. But again, we wanted to furnish ourselves with enough information in terms of making a decision in terms of its use going forward.
And did you start to think of a plan to cater for the contingency that Kingspan might very well not be able to come up with any tests, any successful 8414 tests on any configurations different from the one they tested in 2005?
So in my role at this time, my focus was on getting the information so that we could issue building control final certificates going forward.
Now, it's right, I think, isn't it, that the Nhbc continued to meet Kingspan during 2014, including shortly after they had threatened you with litigation?
The threat of litigation, I think, was towards probably the early part of 2015. But yes, we did continue to meet with them through 2014. Sorry,
you did. Now, I'd like to show you what Ivor Meredith told us when he gave evidence. He worked at Kingspan and he was in charge of the K15 large-scale testing. And now I'm going to show you the transcript, but also an email. I'll show you the email first, please. KIN 405894. And if you go to the email of the 3rd of February 2014 from Ivor Meredith to Tony Millichap, it says, NHBC need your thoughts. Now, this is a week after the meeting, or a week after the meeting, if you see what I mean, week after you reported on it. Tony, I'm getting increasingly concerned about the number of K15 projects that the NHBC are involved in, and the fact that they're referring to us for confirmation that the product is suitable. With this in mind, if you can just check the letter below and give me your thoughts, I do not think I can do any more, apart from allude to our forthcoming test programme, which is what we advised the NHBC we were doing. Kingspan Insulation Limited, during 2014, intend to embark on a test programme to further prove suitability, TM, as Tony Millichap, extend the scope of use for, cool therm K15 in high-rise facades, therefore would appreciate feedback on any combustible cladding systems that you are typically adopting in high-rise buildings. The reason NHBC are asking for this information at the moment is because they do not want to say no to Kingspan. However, if we cannot provide the correct information, they will say no. If you can provide your sign-off to the letter below and suggest if it needs anything else, it would be appreciated. Now, I've shown you that. Can we keep that on the screen, please, and have now the transcript from Ivor Meredith's evidence at day 76, page 102. And you can see from what's on the screen, at line 12, Ms. Grange is showing Mr. Meredith this email, and she cites it at lines 13 down through the rest of the page. And then if you turn the page, please, to page 103, you can see the transcript shows the email that Ivan Meredith writes to Tony Millerchap, then continues. You see line 15 there. The reason NHBC are asking for this information at the moment is because they do not want to say no to Kingspan, etc., etc. And then the question comes at line 24. Can you help us? Why did NHBC not want to say no to Kingspan? Why was that? Answer, I think it's a matter of cost, really. A high-performance insulation is considerably thinner than the non-combustible alternative. If the cladding zone is reduced, the footprint of the building can be expanded, the fixings, all the bracketry, everything is considerably reduced. There's a massive cost saving to look towards a high-rise. Massive cost savings to look towards utilising high performance in high-rise or in any wall build-up. And then here comes the question and answer at 104 line 10. So you think the NHBC were reluctant to stop using K15 on buildings it was involved with because K15 was cheaper than the other alternatives and therefore advantageous to it? Answer, yes. And I think maybe they'd gone down the route of a number of buildings already and they were worried that they needed us to provide more satisfactory information so they didn't have to maybe go back to those buildings and correct how it had been installed, maybe. Question, yes, so they're also worried that they've got K15 on a lot of existing buildings. Answer, yes. And they don't want to have to go and take it all down. Yes, certainly. And the question for you is, was Ivan Meredith correct in what he said here, particularly from line 10 to 24 on page 104 there?
No, he's not. My consideration at that time was ensuring that we had information to demonstrate that that material could be used.
Was he not right that the NHBC was concerned about the cost consequences of stopping using K15 because it was cheaper than the other alternatives?
I don't recall conversations happening about that at that time, no.
Was he not right that the NHBC were worried about the amount of buildings on which they had approved K15 historically?
Not in conversations I was party to, no.
There must have been a concern at the NHBC, as you told us.
In my role at that time, my role was looking at how we could get the information for builders to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations.
Indeed.
My role was not concerned with previous buildings or whatever. My focus at that time was working with industry to get solutions to solve solutions, to get solutions or to identify if those products could be safe.
So whose role was it? Well, let me ask it this way. Did anybody within HBC have a role of looking back at the overhang, the legacy of the use of K15 above 18 metres and working out whether or not those configurations complied with the building regulations and ADB?
I don't know at that time.
You don't know?
No.
Now, you met Kingspan again in April 2014. If we go, please, to NHB 50688, this is an email chain from that month. Let's look at the second email down in the chain that starts at the bottom of page 1 and goes over to page 2. It's an email from Dave White, 2nd of April 2014, to a number of individuals, including Philip Pettinger, copy to John Lewis, Graham Perrior, and you, as you can see, Mr. Evans, there. And if we go to page 2, we can see the text of it. And he says, FYI, to clarify, in response to the various emails below, NHBC had a follow-up meeting with Kingspan today to discuss further testing in relation to fire performance of the K15 insulation board product on walls above 18 metres. Although some additional testing has recently been done, there are still, and this is in bold, no further reports yet issued to prove performance for a typical multi-storey framed building where the wall build-up includes light gauge stud framing filled with insulation and covered by exterior grade fire-resistant sheathing board onto which the K15 is fixed. So to clarify on the current situation for walls 18 metres and above, and this is in caps, only wall build-up for which we have full proof of fire performance of K15 insulation is for a blockwork masonry backing wall, this is all in bold and caps, i.e. as described in BRE Fire Test Report 220876 for Kingspan insulation on a multi-stall wall, bold, tested as defined by BR135 and BS8414 Part 1. This is referred to in BBA Certificate 084582, but may not be absolutely clear from the way it's presented in the current cert. And then underneath that, in bold, we plan to review this again with Kingspan pending results from ongoing BRE fire testing in the coming months. Now, that is you got that email at the time. Was there anything about that email that was not crystal clear to you?
No.
No. To be clear, do you accept that as of early April 2014, there were still no further successful BS8414 tests involving Kingspan K15, other than the BS8414 Part 1 test done in 2005 and referred to in the BBA certificates?
Yes.
Yes. Is it true, as it appears that it was, that Nhbc was still approving and warranting K15 in a variety of build-ups in April 2014, even though Nhbc had been questioning its use since August 2013 and no further full-scale testing had been forthcoming, which was successful and which would therefore justify an application wider than or different from the 2005 test build-up?
So again, at this point in 2014, the buildings we would be issuing final certificates for and offering warranty on would have been built under the previous BBA certificate. So again, in order to comply with the BBA certificate, which at that point said it could be used to demonstrate compliance with 12 or 12.5, 12.6 and 12.7, providing there was reference to the manufacturer, if that was in place, then those final certificates and warranties we offered at that time would have still been valid.
That may be a reason for what you were doing, but I'm asking you whether you were doing it. Let me try the question a different way. Was there ever a building over 18 metres which used K15 in the exact build-up for which Kingspan had successfully tested to 8414 Part 1 in 2005?
I don't know.
You don't know. As at early 2014, is it not correct that all of Nhbc's historic approvals and warranties of external wall build-ups using K15 over 18 metres were on build-ups different from the one tested in 2005?
I don't know if they all were.
Well, had you ever come across yourself, or to your knowledge, your colleagues, a build-up using the materials and in exactly the same configuration as the wall build-up used in the 2005 K15 test?
I can't say that there were some or there weren't. I don't know. I haven't been involved in every project that's been undertaken by Nhbc.
When you got this email, did you not think to yourself, golly, goodness, we've got now to do a backwards-looking audit to find out what buildings K15 is on in order to make sure that they are only on buildings containing an external wall build-up identical to that used for the 2005 test and none other? Did you do that?
No.
Why not?
As I said, my focus at this point was working to gain information that builders could demonstrate compliance with the building regulations going forward.
Yeah.
There is nothing to say that those buildings which had been built at that time were not safe. Had we issued an edict saying we're no longer using K15, and that caused doubt on previous buildings which had been built, the builders could have, the building owners, the builder could have actually had those configurations tested to demonstrate compliance. So there was not enough information to furnish us with that.
Can we go up the email chain? Because this continues. Top of the first page, we can see a response to Dave White's email from Philip Pettinger, who was a special projects manager, and his email is dated the next day, 3rd of April 2014, and it comes to Dave White, John Lewis, you, and Graham Perrier, copy to Steve Cook. Importance high. And then he says this, and I just should say Phil Pettinger, who is an MCABE and an ICIOB, was project manager, special projects within the Technical Services Department. That is who he is. And you can just see that on the screen at the bottom. And he says this, without exaggeration, every building, every is in bold and underlined, by the way, so the tone of this email correspondence is quite strident. Without exaggeration, every building SRPM deal with, which are over 18 metres in height, on extremes now pushing 250 metres in height, propose / have used Kingspan K15, and I would guess that 90% or more, all in bold, are light gauge steel infill framed walls with either brickwork and or rain screen external cladding. This would include building control jobs also. On warranty-only jobs, we are accepting K15 if the building control body is happy and deem it to comply. They always are and do! ! We are adopting the same approach to our own warranty and BC jobs subject to our surveyors. And then, in bold and red, just for clarity and to avoid confusion, are our building control teams accepting K15 this for these types of jobs at the moment? ? It would be good to know as we get asked by various developers and contractors. This question will come up in a meeting next week for a 75-storey resi building and suspect it will be the key factor as to whether NHBC undertake the BC or not. However, Tower Hamlets officer John McGeary is also looking at this situation and is fully aware of the issues, not sure of his decision on, though, they will be the alternative BC provider. Thanks. Kind regards, Phil Pettinger. Now, that email, again, when you got that, were you in any doubt about what it was that Mr. Pettinger was saying?
No.
No. His email, it accords, doesn't it, with the impression that Ivor Meredith got, as in accordance with the transcript I showed you, doesn't it, that NHBC had approved a lot of buildings with K15 on it historically, which were different from the test.
Yes.
Yes. Now, you addressed part of this email in your statement, so I should show you that. Let's go to your statement at page 29, please, paragraph 87, where you can be, if we just have that, paragraph 87 on page 29, you say, after Dave Alexander White, that's his name, it's Dave White, isn't it? His full name is Alexander White.
Yes.
Yes. After Dave Alexander White sent an internal update dated 2nd April 2014 highlighting that there was only one BS8414 test for K15, Philip Pettinger sent a number of us an email dated 3rd of April in terms of the question in the Rule 9 request about this email, and then you go on about to answer some questions about that. But I think it's right, isn't it, that nothing in your statement here doubts what Phil Pettinger is saying.
No.
We don't need the statement for this question. Why was it that the NHBC warranty team were simply accepting K15 above 18 metres if it was outside building control, if outside building control officers were doing the same?
So where we're the warranty body, we're not the enforcing building control body, obviously. So there was a process at that time where if we had if the warranty assessors or our building inspectors had questions in terms of building regs compliance, they could, and not all cases, but they could ask the builder to get the view of the building control body, so the enforcing building control body, and if the building control body came back and said, actually, we've assessed it, we're comfortable with it, then in most cases we would accept that for
I see.
situation and issue a warranty.
Right. So was it the case that actually NHBC's warranty team wasn't separately underwriting the risk of non-compliance? They were essentially, so to speak, following the leader in this case being building control?
So those inspectors, the special risk project managers and the inspectors are not underwriters. They're inspecting in accordance with our standards. And compliance with the standards, R1 requirement one of the standards is that the building meets the national building regulations or standards, depending on your research. So if they had a query in terms of whether it met the building regulations, there was a process whereby they could ask the builder to provide evidence from their building control body to verify that the building control body had assessed it in accordance with the building regulations and they were comfortable with it. And they could take that as evidence that R1 had been met in terms of our standards.
Right. Just taking that in stages, what evidence did your inspectors see that the building control officers were seeing, which showed that K15 above 18 metres did comply with the building regulations and the approved documents?
So the inspectors wouldn't see the information. They would see an undertaking from whoever the building control body was, that they'd assessed it. So that could be a communication, it could be an email, they could have even met the building control surveyor for the other approved inspector or local authority on site.
Why was NHBC's warranty team simply accepting the approach of the building control officers and not doing their own assessment?
In terms of yes, you are relying on the professionalism and the expertise of the other building control body, but there was no reason to doubt that they hadn't done that assessment or weren't comfortable with the materials that have been used. It wasn't just used for the use of K15 or for other, there would be other areas as well.
Were you not concerned to hear that K15 was being accepted in every instance by building control officers, at least according to Phil Pettinger?
It made me more aware of the fact that what was happening in industry with this material, and made me more, determined to solve it and move forward with a solution.
No. Maybe my question wasn't clear enough. The reason I'm suggesting that you ought to have been extremely concerned to hear that K15 was being accepted by building officers was because NHBC was warranting the use of K15 above 18 metres in circumstances where it wasn't compliant with the building regulations, which you knew by early April 2014 at the latest.
My focus at this time was on building regulations and building control compliance and ensuring that we had enough information to be able to issue the building control final certificate. My involvement from warranty was not necessarily in our historic portfolio of warranted buildings. That wasn't my area of expertise or my area of what NHBC employed me to do.
Whose was it?
That would be others within the organisation. So
right.
The executive board, the board itself, executive committee.
Did anybody, to your knowledge, go to the executive board or the executive committee and tell them that there was, as you had now discovered, a historical overhang of buildings over 18 metres which had used K15 in the external wall build-up, which was not compliant with the building regulations, and that therefore at the NHBC had a potentially enormous exposure?
I and John Lewis prepared a report for our senior managers, which highlighted the issues we'd had and the discussions we'd had with Kingspan K15, and which proposed a way forward. I understand that report was taken to the board by Ian Davis, who was the operations director at the time. I'm not sure of the discussions which happened at the board in respect of that, or whether indeed they discussed any legacy or whatever.
Was the NHBC's stance on K15 and combustible materials a factor in whether they were winning work in the market?
No.
Was the pressure from builders to allow combustible materials in external walls the reason why, despite being aware from late 2013 of the dangers that they posed, the NHBC was still accepting them as at April 2014?
No.
Had any combustible insulation materials been refused on buildings by the time of Phil Pettinger's email?
I don't know.
Now, that's right, isn't it, that the situation with Kingspan progressed beyond April 2014 throughout the rest of that year, with threats made by NHBC that they would refuse to sanction the use of K15 over 18 metres without further testing.
That's correct, yes.
But in fact, the NHBC didn't follow through on those threats, did it, at any time during that year?
It didn't, no.
No. Why is that?
Kingspan would continually come back with counter proposals in terms of testing was still happening, they were still awaiting the outcome of reports. They were going to involve Arup, who is a well-respected fire engineer, in terms of doing an assessment against those reports. So there was, as we went through those meetings, there were always sort of reasons put forward as to why they hadn't fulfilled the promises from before, but always that we're still working on it, we're trying hard, and the promise of further information to arrive.
Mr. Chairman, I've got about 5 more minutes of questions on this line, and then we go to a totally different topic. I would quite like to finish it off if we can.
You could put up with another 5 minutes, I think, Mr. Evans, could you?
I can, yeah.
Yes. Yes, very well, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to draw your attention, Mr. Evans, to the witness statement of Dr. Malcolm Rochford, who was the technical director at Kingspan at this time, 2014. Can we go to it, please? At KIN 408838, page 42. And on that page at paragraph 10.2, he says, as far as I can recall, Kingspan regarded the NHBC as playing a critical role in the sale of certain insulation products to construction areas. It was seen as critical to ensure that the NHBC was content with Kingspan's products in order to maximise the sale of those products into construction areas in which the NHBC played a role. Was there any pressure or lobbying of the NHBC by Kingspan or other manufacturer?
No, not to me. There were, obviously, as we met and requested information, there were promises of information to come. And I now know, obviously, from listening to information and previous information from the inquiry, that some of that was not entirely truthful. But I wouldn't. No, not lobbying to accept it. No, they seemed genuine to start off with, in terms of wanting to provide that information and work with us. And as we went through that year, they kept making promises which weren't fulfilled, and that's where we came to the position where we eventually changed our position.
And I think you accept that. If you don't, please tell me. But do you accept that the NHBC should have been more assertive with Kingspan and actually stopped accepting K15 instead of just making empty threats while routinely accepting their combustible insulation on any old high-rise, regardless of how close it was to the 2005 build-up?
We should have been more assertive in getting that information sooner, or changing our position sooner, yes.
And being blunt, why did you not simply show them who was boss and shut them down instead of rolling over and playing nice?
I'm not sure I would term it as rolling over and playing nice. We were trying to work with the manufacturer. I'd never, previous manufacturers we'd worked with to furnish information, would eventually give us that information we needed. They would be able to demonstrate that compliance. There was no reason to suspect at this point that Kingspan, in the early stages with Kingspan, that they weren't going to be able to do that.
And can I suggest a reason why you weren't tougher with them? And that is because had you been tougher with them, you would have had, as you put it, upheaval, or as one of the emails puts it, a barrage of claims from a myriad building owners.
My concern and my focus at the time was not on the historic projects. My concern was with the buildings which were presently going through the design. And yes, one of the things that I did consider, we did consider, was that if we'd at that point had a knee-jerk reaction and stopped accepting it, or started accepting it in designs going forward, it could have provided a lot of disruption. But we were making that decision at that point on the only information we had at that point was positive. We didn't have all the facts at that point, and we wanted to give ourselves the opportunity to get all of those facts before we made any decision like that.
And the facts were facts which would provide rock-solid reassurance, both that continuing to use K15 over 18 metres in other build-ups was safe, and that historically it had been safe. But until you had those facts, you could only conclude that the situation was unsafe, surely.
I had no information at that time that it was not safe. So the information I had at the time was positive in terms of the use of that material. We had the BBA certificate, which said it could be used in certain conditions, if those conditions were met. And we, as part of that, we had a test, which was positive. We had no information relating to any failed tests at that time. At that point, we asked Kingspan in the early meetings if they had any failed tests. They said they hadn't. I now know from listening to evidence earlier in the inquiry that wasn't true. But yeah, so we would always try, as long as I've been in building control, it's been a collaborative function in terms of working with the builders and industry to build safe buildings. I saw this as no different to that in terms of my approach.
Does it come to this, that the NHBC allowed a non-compliant insulation product to continue to be built into new buildings and to remain on countless others, putting their occupants at risk merely because you had no evidence that it wasn't safe?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. NHBC, do you accept, on what you've been telling us, that the NHBC's approach was to allow a non-compliant insulation product to continue to be built into new buildings and to remain on countless others, putting their occupants at risk merely because you had no evidence, or no evidence yet, that the material wasn't safe?
At this stage, my focus and my remit was to look at the future in terms of moving forward and being able to provide, or being able to allow builders, get builders to be able to give us the information to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations. I had no part to play at that time in terms of our legacy projects.
Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful. And I'm grateful to the transcriber as well for allowing us to sit a little bit late. But is that a convenient moment?
I think it is, yes. Well, I think that is a good point to stop for the day, Mr. Evans. We'll finish there. We'll resume, I'm afraid, tomorrow morning, please, at 10 o'clock. And in the meantime, as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it. All right?
Thank you.
And we'll see you at 10 o'clock tomorrow. If you'd like to go to the usher now, that'll be fine. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 10 o'clock tomorrow, then,
10
please.
o'clock.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.